noise in it, and so I was like trying to talk over the restaurant, and I've had scratchy throat ever since. It's so weird. I don't feel bad at all, but my throat sounds weird because I was talking over all this noise. So anyway, that's okay. That's a good reason to have that. Okay, so we're jumping back into the book of Daniel. I want you to go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 11. So we're almost to the end of Daniel, and we have been studying Daniel this entire year. We went through the first 6 chapters before Christmas and looked at the life of Daniel, the man, and kind of looked at how he was an amazing man of God with integrity, and he was known to be excellent in his spirit. He was raised up to high levels within the royalty of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian royalty, as well as in Cyrus and Darius's reign as well. So Daniel was an amazing man to look at his life. So the first 6 chapters deal with that. But now the second group of chapters, this last 7 chapters or 6 chapters, have been about prophecy. They have actually held from chapter 7 all the way to 12. We have some amazing prophecy that has come to pass, that Daniel writes about. And so that's what we've been studying since January. So now what we are in is the final 3 chapters. And I say it that way because chapters 10, 11, and 12 go together. Okay, so they're not to be read separately, even though we're reading them separately so that we can take them apart a little bit. They literally are an entire chapter 10 sets it all up, and then 11 and 12 is the actual prophecy that happens through what's happening in chapter 10, if that makes sense. So you really need to read all 3 of those together. Now, if you've been reading them, you also are reading them and going, okay, great, I'm reading them together, and I have absolutely no idea what it's talking about because you're reading it, but it actually is very difficult for us to read because we require history to truly understand it. And so that is kind of where we are going to be tonight. If you are new here tonight, it's your first time, welcome, super glad you're here. Please plan to come back next week because what tonight is going to be filled with a lot of setting up history, and we've got some cool stuff to talk about. But 11 and 12, the rest of 11 and chapter 12 are going to be wonderful information that continues the prophecy, but also takes us into a lot more about Revelation and the final days that we have to look forward to, prophecy that hasn't been fulfilled yet. So we're going to be talking about that. We're actually going to look at a lot of Revelation during the last 2 weeks of our study. So that's going to be coming up. So just make sure that you don't completely get confused. There might be a little bit of things that are confusing. What I'm going to do for you next week, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this, I'm going to precursor this. I am going to bring you a handout next week that contains all the facts I'm about to go over. Okay, so you can write these down to help yourself, but because we're going to finish it next week, there's no way we can get through all of it tonight. I will have bullet pointed facts for you, like so that you can take it home and see this is what happened in chapter 11. Because as we get into it, you'll find out it is just filled with this very intricate story of historical events that happened that Daniel prophesies about. And so I want you to have that, and you can look it up in commentaries and everything, but I'm going to bring you one that's pretty easy to kind of grab onto, kind of like a quick guide to chapter 11, but I will bring that next week. So you got to come back so you can get that. But for tonight, let's go ahead and just set up a little bit of this, because like I said, 10, 11, 12 go together. So let me just briefly take a look at, talk about what happens in chapter 10. We're not going back to all of it, but this is what happens. At the beginning of chapter 10, we have Daniel in distress. He has been praying and in mourning and fasting. So fasting for 21 days, waiting for God to explain some things to you. He's actually got conflict in his spirit. If you look at chapter 10, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Cyrus, this is the first verse, of Persia, Daniel, also known as Belshazzar, had another vision. He understood that the vision concerned events certain to happen in the future, times of war and great hardship. When the vision came to me, I, Daniel, had been in mourning for 3 whole weeks. All that time I had eaten no rich food, no meat and wine had crossed across my lips, and I used no fragrant lotions until those 3 weeks had passed. On April 23rd, I was standing on the bank of the Great Tigris River, and I looked up and saw a man dressed in linen clothing with a belt of pure gold around his waist. His body looked like a precious gem. His face flashed like lightning, and his eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet shone like polished bronze, and his voice roared like a vast multitude of people. Only I, Daniel, saw this vision. The men with me saw nothing. But they were suddenly terrified and ran away to hide. So I was left there all alone to see this amazing vision. My strength left me. My face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. And then I heard the man speak. And when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. Okay, so I'm just reading those first 3 verses, just to cover the first little section to tell you what's happening here. So Daniel, during the 3rd year of the reign of King Cyrus of Persia. So Cyrus of Persia is the king of Persia at this time, who has told the Israelites, you can go back to Jerusalem. He sent them home. So they've been in captivity for 70 years. He's actually given them the cue that they can go home. We don't know why, but many of them choose not to go home. They just decide to stay in Babylon. Daniel is in great distress too during this time, right here during this time. He's been praying, possibly praying for his people, wondering why. Maybe he's in mourning for that, but he's also seen this vision. This vision is really leaves him sort of shaking in his boots. He doesn't really understand it because it's a vision of conflict and war in the future. But he doesn't totally understand. He doesn't understand it, but he's seen this vision. So as he is there, a man dressed in linen, it describes him as, he describes it as, I looked up and I saw a man dressed in linen clothing. What we think, very likely, this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, which I think is something that we can legitimately say. There are different ways you can look at that. Some people say it's just an angel, but because it lines up so well with Revelations chapter 1, when John sees the vision of Jesus, almost the exact description here, many scholars, theologians believe that this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus who has come to Daniel. Daniel is he's so overwhelmed, he faints, he falls, all his strength leaves him when he sees this vision. The man spoke, it doesn't say what he says, but when he speaks, his face flashed and it says, only I saw him, and he said, so I was left there all alone, my strength left me, my face grew deathly pale, I felt very weak. Then I heard the man speak, and when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted. So the sound of the voice of this man causes him just to faint and to lay there with absolutely no strength whatsoever. So there's a lot of reason, if you look at all this, to think this possibly is a pre-incarnate meaning before Jesus is actually born, because we know Jesus has been here since the beginning of time. So he comes as a baby, but that was just his coming, that was his incarnation as a man. But he has been with the Father. His Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit have been here since the beginning of time, since they're eternal. And Jesus is not a separate to God. They're all Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So, all that being said, this pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus comes before him. He's fainted, and then the angel comes up. Then the next verse, and if you look in verse 10, it says, just then a hand touched me and lifted me, still trembling, to my hands and knees. And the man said to me, Daniel, you are very precious to God. So listen carefully to what I have to say to you. Stand up, for I have been sent to you. When he said this to me, I stood up, still trembling. Now, what people who believe, this is just a little side note, I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to say it again. People who believe that first vision, the man with the linen garment, is the pre-incarnate version of Jesus, believe that in verse 10, we have another person speaking. It's not that person in the linen garment. It is an angel who is now talking to him. Now, when you get into chapter 12, you will find out there is a man hovering over the water, and then there are 2 other people there. There's actually 3 people in this scene, besides Daniel, that we will find out more about. That's why you have to read all 3 chapters together. So we haven't read those, but in chapter 12, there will be 3 people there. So very possible that Jesus is one of them. He is not doing the talking. He is doing the guiding. He is there, but he is not necessarily doing the talking. It is the angel who is speaking here. So you'll find out more when we get to chapter 12 about that, but just to kind of put that on the side note, you can read commentaries that will tell you, no, this was just an angel. The problem with it is it does line up very much with the same vision that John had of what Jesus looked like in the beginning of Revelation. That is why it's hard to sort of separate them. The reason why we do believe that in verse 10 and on, we have an angel talking, is because when you go on to verse 12, it says, don't be afraid, Daniel, since the first day you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before your God. Your request has been heard in heaven. I have come to answer your prayer, but for 21 days, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me, and I left him there with the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia. So what it tells us is this angel that's speaking was not able to get there for 21 days because he was held up in a spiritual warfare with a demon, the prince of Persia, the one who was controlling Persia's king. Okay, so this is very interesting here, and that's why we don't believe that's Jesus. Jesus would need help. Jesus would have fought him off himself. So that's why we don't believe verse 10 and on is Jesus speaking, but potentially it could be a pre-incarnate Jesus before that. And I don't want to call him Jesus, we call him pre-incarnate Jesus, because he isn't, when he came as a child. Are y'all totally confused? You got it? What I'm talking about? You following me, flowing? Okay. So I think that's just important just to keep saying, just to be able to understand, because there's some speakers. And in chapter 11, we have an angel that's going to basically do the entire chapter. He's going to continue telling the story or telling about the vision. He's giving the interpretation of the vision. So Daniel is seeing this vision. He is very disturbed by it. He needs some clarification. The angel shows up to help him. And now let's just flip down to verse 21. So we have over and over again. I did talk about this a little bit last week, and we talked a little bit about angels and what they're like. But what's really, really sweet about this whole chapter, if you want to go back and read chapter 10, over and over again, every time Daniel becomes overcome, one of the angels touches him, lifts him up, comes and strengthens him. So through this time, we get to see some of the actions of angels. We get to see what they do. They minister to the saints. Daniel is an 80-year-old man at this point, somewhere in his 80s. He has been serving God faithfully. We can even make the claim that before he even entered Babylon as a slave, he had made the decision that he would serve his God, and he would not be thrown off by that. No matter what happened when he got to Babylon, he was going to stand for God. He was going to be a person who lived for God and didn't bend, and that's what he does. We find that out all throughout the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So here he is, this 80-year-old man, struggling with this vision. He has overcome. He's been seeing visions. This is his 4th vision, and all of the visions have been sort of troubling. There have been some positive things, but there's also been some troubling things about what's going to happen to his people. So chapters 7 through 12 is the story of Israel. It's the prophecy about Israel. And you can go back and say the first 6 chapters have a lot more to do with the time of the Gentiles, the Gentile rulers. Nebuchadnezzar is kind of seen a lot, and then we get Cyrus and Darius a little bit, but mainly Nebuchadnezzar through the first 6 chapters. So he's a Gentile ruler, and he begins the time of the Gentiles. So the first 6 chapters, now we have the second 6 chapters all about the future of Israel. Okay, so you following me? So now all these visions are in reference to what's going to happen to Daniel's people. And the angel's giving him instructions about what's going to happen. This is prophetic history. So let's talk about prophecy for just a minute. Because this entire book is about prophecy. And I think that it's worth talking about just a little bit. I want to give you just a definition of prophecy for just a minute. And I know that you kind of know what it is, probably know basically what it is. But prophecy is the foretelling of events. It's telling ahead of time, right? History is telling the past events. So a historian looks at what happened and then he tells what happened. It's all past tense. But prophecy is all foretelling. This is what's going to come. So it's a different type of writing. And what we have here is prophetic history. So we're going to look at it from a historical standpoint because it has happened, this part that we're reading in chapter 11, but it had not happened when Daniel wrote it down. It was prophetic. It was a foretelling. So there's a few things about prophecy that you need to know. To be considered prophecy, it has to be told before it happens, right? Because that's kind of a duh there. It has to be specific, not vague. It can't just be some broad thing about something. That's not considered true prophecy. Prophecy has to be specific, giving detailed things that have a very definite thing. And you've seen that all throughout chapter 7 through 11 up to now. There's been a lot of detailed prophecy that has happened. So it needs to be specific in nature. And then it also cannot be, this is really important, it cannot be accounted for by chance. Oh, that just happened by chance. That just was a coincidence. Maybe it's just, could have happened. It has to be, true prophecy can happen, it's found to be true prophecy if it could not happen. If there's no way that you could actually explain it any other way, except for it was the truth told and then it happens, right? Does that make sense? It can't just be a random occurrence. So, the Bible, all of the prophets in the Bible, all the prophecies that were given in the Bible, every single one of them, 100%, all the foretelling that's already have all come true. So everything that's not apocalyptic or futuristic, which there is still some prophecy to be done that's supposed to happen at the very end of the age. That prophecy, the prophecy from some of Revelation and also some of Daniel, that is later. And also there's a little bit in Ezekiel and Zechariah. Those are later prophecies. Those are prophetic that are going to happen later on at the end of the times. Every other prophecy, from starting all the way back to Genesis up through, has been 100% fulfilled with complete accuracy to what was written. Okay? So that is pretty phenomenal. And a lot of people are looking, you have people all along that say, well, I'm not sure if I believe in God. Okay, fulfilled prophecy is your answer. If you learn how to talk to them about fulfilled prophecy and explain that to them, there's really not a lot they can refute about it. They can say, well, whatever, and they can just blow it off. But the truth is, fulfilled prophecy is probably one of the number one reasons why we can believe that God exists. Because the things that were written about from Genesis all the way through that have come true could not have happened by chance. Just absolutely could not have happened by chance. So, prophets do not make mistakes. I want to read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 18. You can write this down and read all of it sometime if you want to. But chapter 18, verses 18 through 22, God talks about prophecy, and I want to just read this to you. It is talking through the mouth of Moses, and he says, I will raise up him a prophet like you from among the brothers. He's talking about the coming of prophets, right? So before Moses isn't really, he is kind of a prophet in his time. But later God's going to send lots of prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Job, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, we know a lot of them. Some of us, if we've been listening to these messages recently. So all these prophets, God's going to raise up. So that's what he's talking about here. I'm going to raise them up. I will put my words in. So he says, I will raise up a prophet like you from among their brothers. So he'll just be one of you. I'll raise him up. I will put my words in his mouth. And he will tell the people, everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything that I have not told her, commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods must be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. So he's basically preparing them for false prophets, people who will come and say things that have not come true. And they will claim to be prophets and they'll claim to give messages, but their messages don't come true. Only God can have fulfilled prophecy. Only God can foretell this future, because God is not, space and time have no connection with God, right? God knows what's going to happen before, what's happened in the past. God is not, nothing is coming as a surprise to him. And so God is different. He's omnipresent, omniscient, all of those things. And so he is the only one who can make a prophet. He's the only one that can send prophecy or write prophecy. So a genuine prophet does not make mistakes because he's speaking from God. He is speaking the words of God. He's not speaking his own words. So just a couple of other quick things about prophecy here. Predicted prophecy, which is what we're talking about here. This particular section in chapter 11 that we're about to read is what we call predictive prophecy, about things that are going to happen. To be considered valid, it must pass a number of tests. So let me give you a few of these real quick. So number one, it must be given before the fulfillment. I already read a couple of these to you. I'm going to give you a few more details here. Before the fulfillment takes place. So it has to be given before to be true prophecy, duh. It seems pretty basic there. But it can't be prophecy if somebody comes back and writes it later, right? But so I'm going to write prophecy about something that happened, 200 years ago and then claim that was prophecy. That would not make sense. But some people do that. So that's not dealing with prophecy, that's history. The prophecy must be explicit or detailed, as I mentioned. This is very crucial. And so we're not going to have vague words, and it must be specific. It must be able, now this is kind of an important thing here, the prophecy must be able to be falsified. What this means is it needs to be of such a nature that it can be proven to be false. It has to contain elements that can be either proven to be true or false. Unless a prophecy can be falsified, it is meaningless. Does that make sense? Doesn't mean that so it's just saying if it can't be proven false, then it's not true prophecy. So if we say 3 kings are going to come, and so that's something that can be true, that can be proven false. If 3 kings don't come next, that's what we're about to read in chapter 11. So that could be proven false. So that's another one of the things that you look for if it can be proven false. Not that it's going to be, I'm not trying to confuse you, but if it can be proven false, then it can be considered prophecy because it's got a true or false, right or wrong. It's not vague. It kind of goes back to the whole vagueness there. You can't prove something false if it's so vague, right? But we can prove something false if it says, there will be 3 people, blah, 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 and only 1 shows up. That would be proven false. So hope that's making sense. Let me just keep on going here. Let's don't get confused on that one. The prophet cannot have any part in the fulfillment. So a prophet can't give the prophecy and then go help it get fulfilled. That's a key to prophecy. And every one of the prophecies in the Bible were never helped along by the people who gave the prophecy. Never. They're always before the event, and other people brought those things to light. Okay, so that's another thing. The fulfillment must correspond exactly to the prediction. So if it's going to be fulfilled, it has to be exactly like it's predicted. It can't be a little bit like it and kind of just general, we can just figure that out. No, it has to be exactly. And then we've got some great examples. So those are kind of the key 5 things that you're looking for here. A couple of really, really key things. Jesus. So this is a good week to talk about Jesus, right? So we're in the Holy Week here. Jesus fulfilled every single prophecy that was spoken about him. At somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 and something prophecies were completely and totally fulfilled through Jesus, very specifically. Made hundreds and hundreds of years before, some of them thousands of years before he came onto the scene. Nothing. Remember, God was silent for 400 years. There was not one single prophecy that was made less than 400 years before Jesus came. So they were all at least 400 years, but even more than that. The very last prophecy that's given is in Malachi, that I will send basically John the Baptist to come before you to prepare the way. That was the last prophecy. 400 years later, John the Baptist comes on the scene. So prophecy is hundreds of years before, and Jesus fulfilled every single one of the things that was written about him. That is absolutely impossible. You've heard this statistic before, and Ken even brought it up on Sunday, but just having fulfilled prophecy 10 to the 17th power, it is absolutely statistically impossible for even one man to fulfill eight prophecies. And he fulfilled over 300 of them. So that one thing in and of itself is enough to say, wait a minute, God is real. Jesus Christ is who he said he was because he fulfilled prophecy. And that is, I think, we've seen, you could probably go do, if you did some data research, you could find that there have been thousands and thousands of people that were atheists who came to faith in Christ because of fulfilled prophecy. That one fact made it so difficult for them to just blow it off anymore. They couldn't just say, well, Jesus isn't really real, when they see that these were written hundreds of years before him and then he fulfills them. So it's pretty amazing. So here's a few, just real quick. The birthplace of the Messiah was Bethlehem of Ephrathah. Read this the other day. The least of the clans of Judah, from you will come for me, the future ruler of Israel, whose origins go back to the distant past, to the days of old. Micah 5:2. Very famous passage, but talking about Bethlehem being the place where the Messiah will be born. His family line will be a descendant of David. The Old Testament predicted the exact family line that the Messiah would come from. And so Abraham talks about it in Genesis 22. The seed shall all in your seed, in thy seed, talking to Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because thou hast obeyed my voice. And then in Genesis 21:12, God said to Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of the bondwoman and all that Sarah has said unto thee, hearken unto the voice, for in Isaac shall be, your seed will be called. And we could just go in, there's tons and tons of other ones, talking about David and the line of Jesus. Jesus came from the line of David and Abraham. That line absolutely can be proven through the genealogy in the book of Matthew. You don't want to read the genealogy, but there it is. It gives you that, the begats and the begats, that explains to you where Jesus came from. It takes you all the way back, so take it, look at it. Don't just blow off the genealogy, it's important. It said he must he'll come before Jerusalem and the temples are destroyed. In Daniel chapter 9:26, we read this. In Daniel chapter 9, if you are new here or missed the week we talked about Daniel chapter 9, please go to valadams.com and go to the Bible study tab and look at chapter 9. Listen to, I'm not saying it's great teaching, but it will explain to you what happens in Daniel chapter 9. It is one of the most amazing prophecies in the entire Bible, if not the most amazing. This is one of the things it says. After the 62 sevens, and this is numbers, we talk about numbers in this video, so you can watch it. The anointed one, which is a reference to the Messiah, will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Talking about the Romans, reference to the ruler that will come. The end will come like a flood. We will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Okay, so Jesus had to come before the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's what that particular verse talks about. And then it goes on in Daniel chapter 9 to talk about future things that are going to happen as well. So the future beyond the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So many. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know that. He was a descendant of David. He came before the temple was destroyed. And then we also know things like in Daniel chapter 9, if we went back to that, remember when it says the time that Jesus is going to show up? It gives the exact date. Many believe it's the day that Jesus entered the city on Palm Sunday. So 2 days ago. So that verse in Daniel chapter 9, it says the anointed one, let's see, right here, Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Make sure I read that right there. Listen and understand, 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem, talking about the time with when Artaxerxes actually gives the command to rebuild Jerusalem, until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. So that date there, that little those numbers that seem kind of crazy there, 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7, and 7 represents, we talked about years, and so when you start adding all that up, you end up with coming to the day. And scholars have looked at it and based on what they base a lot of calendars on, looking at the Old Testament calendars, the Jewish calendar, that is the day that Jesus enters Jerusalem. And then he will be cut off, a reference to being basically killed, is what it's talking about. And that particular word that's used there specifically kind of alludes to a crucifixion. There's, in Isaiah, it talks about Jesus being pierced. The word pierced, at that time, there were no crucifixions being done in Isaiah. Crucifixion was not a form of punishment. It was not a way the person was killed. That was predicted. It was predicted that he would be beaten, that he would be, everybody would, it was so many things in Isaiah chapter 53. Read that, filled with so much prophecy about Jesus. That was, I think, last week's reading as well. So, I could go on and on and on, but I felt that it would be important for us to talk a little bit about that, because now I'm about to go into the history here of all this happens in chapter 11, or at least up through a few verses, and it gets real laborious. But what I want you to what I want you to think about when I read it, and when I go over these details about what he's writing, I want you to think about what I just said about prophecy, how it has to be very specific, how it has to be before it happens, how it has to be something that could be proven false, how it has to be something that really there's no way it could be true by coincidence or chance or any of those sorts of things. So think about that when we read this, because the history lines up exactly with what is written here in this prophecy in chapter 11. The prophecy was given to Daniel by the angel, and if we start with verse, let's go now to chapter 11. Most of you probably have a verse that seems real random for the first verse there. That verse really should be the last verse in chapter 10. It should not be chapter 11, verse 1 should really be chapter 10, verse 22. So I'm just going to read it. And actually, my Bible has it. So some of you might have that. Mine's actually in chapter 10, this little New Living Translation. But it says, so the angel is talking to him, and he's giving him all this. He says, meanwhile, verse 21, I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one helps me against these spirit princes except Michael, your spirit prince. The spirit princes he's talking about are demons, and Michael is the archangel that helps with the fight. And then in verse 11, verse 1, I have been standing beside Michael to support and strengthen him since the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede. So what that tells us is that Michael has been assigned to Darius the Mede. Now, hang on, wait a minute. Isn't Darius the Mede a Gentile ruler? Why would God send an angel to a Gentile ruler to help him? Well, because Darius, at this time, is the king that is part of helping send the Israelites back to rebuild Jerusalem. He is the one that God has allowed to be in control. We have talked about all throughout the book of Daniel, the sovereignty of God. God puts kings on the thrones. He takes kings off the thrones. He is the one in charge. Does that mean that God will sometimes maybe send an angel to maybe a Gentile, possibly even a pagan king? Maybe. If it's going to help fulfill the purposes that he has for the whole big picture. God has a story. We do not see all of it. We are literally only a little piece of that story. We can only see what is right around us. It's just like if you're driving on a mountain and you can only see a little bit ahead of you, that's where we are. We're living that. God sees the whole mountain. He sees all the hills and every single thing that's going to happen in your life, and you're just living that little part of it. And so God, if he decides to put an angel over a Gentile king to protect his people ultimately, then that's what he can do. So what we don't know specifically is all we know is this gives us an indication that God is using the spiritual warriors and the angels that are out there to help fight the battles in this world. And it could be that he is using pagan kings, could be using Christian kings. It doesn't always, people are always like, well, we want a Christian president. I mean, really? We want God, we want who God allows to be on the throne. Now, sometimes God allows people that are evil to be in control. Why? We don't know. We don't know the big picture. We're only seeing a little part of it. We are just a little part of the cog of the big wheel. And so you can get frustrated with that, and you can say, well, God, what is he up there doing? What he's doing is something magnificent. It is something so amazing that none of us could ever put it together. We can't understand it in our minds because his ways are not our ways. He is such a big God that literally if he tried to explain to us why he allowed this to happen, we wouldn't get it. It would be we'd be clueless. We'd be going, really? I don't understand that. Right, because it doesn't come in from the mind of man. It comes from the mind of God. And so that's what faith is. Yes, it is faith, but I want to put my faith in a God that I don't understand fully. Because if I can, then he's just a man. And I don't want somebody that I completely figure everything out. You know, now, when we get to heaven, do I think God is going to make all things new? Is he going to help us figure it all out when we get to heaven? We may not care when we get to heaven, because heaven may be so amazing that there may be no reason. But you may be sitting here even tonight going, why have certain things happened in my life? I don't get it, God. I don't understand. I'm crying out to you. I'm begging you to give me a reason. You have got to settle into the fact that you may not get a reason right here on this earth. You may not know, because there is a bigger picture. There is something that God is making and sewing together, weaving together, that is something beyond your wildest dreams. We can see this when we look back at history. We can see how God has worked. I can look back at my life, and I'm sure you can too, and go, you know what? I can truly say that I can see how God was working that, 20 years ago. When I'm living in it, I don't get it. Yeah. And when I'm going through it, but I can look back sometimes and go, yeah, I can see how God allowed that to happen. Why God brought that person in my life and took that person out. I can sometimes see that. There are some things that are still unanswerable. I don't get it. I don't understand why this happened. And I think those are just some of those things that we just have to leave in the hands of God and trust him. But the story and the stuff that we read about in Daniel is something just to confirm and assure us that the God who allowed all these details to come to pass later, that he gave Daniel this vision and said these things are going to come to pass, that is the same God that is going to make the things come to pass, the promises that he has all throughout the word come to pass in your life and in my life. So this predictive prophecy gives us assurance that we are serving a real God who has a plan. Amen. And we can trust in that. So that is why I'm going to give you that before I give you all this. Okay, here we go. Let's go ahead and start reading some of these details real quick, and I'm going to walk you through some of these details about these kings, which are kind of crazy. Okay. Verse 2. Now then, I will reveal the truth to you. 3 more Persian kings will reign, to be succeeded by a 4th, far richer than the others. He will use his wealth to stir up everyone to fight against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will rise to power, who will rule with great authority and accomplish everything he sets out to do. But at the height of his power, his kingdom will be broken apart and divided into 4 parts. It will not be ruled by the king's descendants, nor will the kingdom hold the authority it once had. For his empire will be uprooted and given to others. The king of the south will increase in power, but one of his own officials will become more powerful than he and will rule his kingdom with great strength. Some years later, an alliance will be formed between the king of the north and the king of the south. The daughter of the king of the south will be given in marriage to the king of the north to secure the alliance. But she will lose her influence over him, and so will her father. She will be abandoned along with her supporters. But when one of her relatives becomes king of the south, he will raise an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and defeat him. When he returns to Egypt, he will carry back their idols with him, along with priceless articles of gold and silver. For some years afterward, he will leave the king of the north alone. Later, the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will soon return to his own land. However, the sons of the king of the north will assemble a mighty army which will advance like a flood and carry the battle as far as the enemy's fortress. Then in a rage, the king of the south will rally against the vast forces assembled by the king of the north and will defeat them. After the enemy army is swept away, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived. A few years later, the king of the north will return with a fully equipped army far greater than before. At that time, there will be a general uprising against the king of the south. Violent men among your own people will join them in fulfillment of this vision, but they will not succeed. Then the king of the north will come and lay siege to a fortified city and capture it. The best troops of the south will not be able to stand in the face of the onslaught. The king of the north will march onward unopposed. None will be able to stop him. He will pause in the glorious land of Israel, intent on destroying it. He will make plans to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will force an alliance with the king of the south. He will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom from within, but his plan will fall. After this, he will turn his attention to the coastland and conquer many cities, but a commander from another land will put an end to his insolence and cause him to retreat in shame. He will take refuge in his own fortresses, but will stumble and fall and be seen no more. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor, but after a brief reign, he will die, though not from anger or in battle. The next to come to power will be a despicable man who is not in line for royal succession. He will slip and when least expected and take over the kingdoms by flattery and intrigue. Before him, great armies will be swept away, including a covenant prince. And with deceitful promises, he will make various alliances. He will become strong despite having only a handful of followers. Without warning, he will enter the richest areas of the land. Then he will distribute among his followers the plunder and wealth of the rich, something his predecessors had never done. He will plot the overthrow of strongholds, but this will last for only a short while. Then he will stir up his courage and raise a great army against the king of the south. The king of the south will go to battle with a mighty army, but to no avail, for there will be plots against him. His own household will cause his downfall. His army will be swept away, and many will be killed. Seeking nothing but each other's harm, these kings will plot against each other at the conference table, attempting to deceive each other, but it will make no difference, for the end will come at the appointed time. And then the king of the north will return home with great riches. On the way, he will set himself against the people of the Holy Covenant, doing much damage before continuing his journey. And then at the appointed time, he will once again invade this house, but this time will result in different. And then we could go on and on and on. We're going to pick up there next week. Now, the reason I read that, let me just ask you a question. Was that detailed or was that detailed? If this was written before it happened, and then it happens just like this, that's got to be pretty remarkable, right? That's got to be something that nobody could come up with as a human. There's no chance. It could totally be falsified. Everything about this absolutely is so it is so detailed that it's just absolutely crazy. So here we go. Just hold on to your horse. I'm going to read it real quick and give you these facts here because it's going to be crazy, but here we go. So, 3 more Persian kings. Darius, Artaxerxes, there's different names that these people have been described by. There's actually, their names are different, but the 3 Persian kings come along, and the 4th king, Xerxes, okay, so 3 more Persian kings will reign to be succeeded by a 4th, far richer than the others, and he will use his wealth to stir up everyone to fight against the kingdom of Greece. This king, that 4th king is Xerxes. You can read about him in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. In Esther, he is the king that takes her into his palace. He throws a huge party. He is more wealthy than any other person in the land. He is extravagant. He throws this enormous party for, I think it's 100 and something days to show off all his wealth, to show off all of that. That is written about in Esther that just backs up the fact that he is richer than all the others. History also backs this up from other outside sources, but we can read about it in Esther, so that's one thing that we can back up there. So that's Xerxes. Now, a mighty king, so basically what Xerxes does is he riles up Greece, because if you read about in Esther, you find out that he is putting together an army to go against Greece. Okay, so he has stirred up the anger of Alexander the Great from Greece. The mighty king will rise to power. He will rule with great authority and accomplish everything he sets out to do, but at the height of his power. So then a mighty king. So verse 3 is talking about Alexander the Great. This goes back to chapter 8, the shaggy goat. Okay, so if you go back to chapter 8, if you want to go back to watch my videos and look at actually, that may be the one that didn't get taped. I don't know. But chapter 8, the shaggy goat, is very interesting, that it's all explaining about the coming of Alexander the Great and how he's going to just come and sweep, sort of like flies across and sort of takes over kingdoms, which is true about Alexander the Great. Alexander arose in 335 BC and he died in 323 BC. Very short life he lived. He wasn't very old when he died at the age of 33. But the prophecy said that he would, if you look at what this says, he'll rule with great authority and he'll accomplish everything he sets out to do. That is what Alexander the Great did. But at the height of his power, 33 years old, when he had everything, his kingdom will be broken apart because he dies. And it will be divided into 4 parts. This has already been prophesied in the book in chapter 8. And also it's really prophesied in chapter 2 of Daniel and chapter 7. So 2, 7, and 8 give us these details about it being broken up into 4. This is just another place where it talks about it. 4 parts. It will not be ruled by the king's descendants, nor will the kingdom hold the authority it once had, for his empire will be uprooted. So, Alexander the Great, when he dies, he does not leave any heirs. You would think that if he had heirs, they would take over, right? But he did have 3 people that were actually kin to him that could have been taken over, and they were all killed. They were all, basically executed so that they were not able to take over. So it was given to 4 generals. The 4 generals come from the north, south, east, and west. The Cassander is from Macedonia and Greece, and we have Lysimachus from Thrace, parts of Asia Minor, Ptolemy, Egypt and parts of Asia Minor, and Seleucus, Syria. The only 2 that we really care about are the kings of the north and the south. This is the king, because the south was going to be Egypt and parts of Asia Minor, and the north, which is Ptolemy, and then the north was Syria. And it basically what happened was, as we read through the whole thing, we could put it together in a nutshell. There's warring that goes on for a long time between the north and the south, right? Those leaders of the north and the south, they fight over and over again. This is what it tells us in here. And who's right in the middle? Israel. So Israel is caught in the middle of these wars. Syria, Egypt. Okay, so just kind of picture that on a map. This is what happens. This is what happened in history. There was the fighting between these 2 groups of people, these 4 generals, and then all of their descendants. So, there's a lot of, kind of moving on here, the north versus south here, is kind of what history tells us is a 100-year battle back and forth between the north and the south. The first king is Ptolemy, and he is the king of the way it describes here is the king of the south will increase in power, but one of his own officials will become more powerful than he, and he will rule his kingdom with great strength. And so basically, the king of the north and the king of the south they fight against each other. And if you go back to when Daniel was talking at the beginning of chapter 10, he says he saw a great conflict. In some versions, it said a great conflict, a great warring. And that's what the vision is about, is this whole back and forth, north and south. Now, let me give you some more details here. So now, we're looking in verse 5. Let's go to verse 6. Let me just go ahead and get to this part about the alliance that's formed between the 2. So because they're fighting these, they decide to form an alliance. So they attempt to make peace, and they decide on the marriage contract, which is a lot of times what they try to do. So this in history, I don't know where I lost a name here, so I'm trying to see where my notes went here. Is Hunter? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The first king that's mentioned is Ptolemy Soter, 323 to 285 BC. And then the king of the north that is mentioned second, gains greater power of the first, is Seleucus, and he succeeded in expanding. Then what happens is their descendants here come along, and we get to Antiochus II. So Antiochus II, this is not Antiochus Epiphanes. So we've talked about Antiochus Epiphanes is the last guy that we're going to get to in this chapter. We're not talking about him right now. There's different people named Antiochus. So you're not going to be able to keep up with it. Next week I'm giving you a bullet pointed list. So you're not trying to keep up with all of them. I'm just giving you a few little details here. Bernice was the daughter of Ptolemy, the king of the south. And she is given in marriage to Antiochus. And so Ptolemy of the south and Antiochus of the north agreed to peace on 2 conditions. This is the deal. First, Antiochus divorced his wife. So Antiochus was married to a woman named Laodicea. That's where Laodicea is, actually. And he has to divorce her and marry Ptolemy's daughter, Bernice. And second, that any child of Bernice that she has between the 2 of them would be an heir of Antiochus, because that was the deal they made. Well, it took place, and then Ptolemy dies. And when he dies, Antiochus goes back to his first wife, Laodicea, and she has Bernice and her small child killed. Okay, so you can already see that there's going to be a problem here because people on the south down there are going to be mad about the death of Bernice and this baby. So the baby is killed. She has them killed. And she puts her own son, Seleucus II, in Antiochus's place. Okay, so that's verse 6. Now we get to verse 7. When one of the relatives becomes king of the south, he will raise up an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and defeat him because he's mad about what happened to his sister. Ptolemy II was succeeded Bernice's brother, and he goes up to build up this army. When he returns to Egypt, he will carry back their idols with him, along with priceless articles of gold. So this is Ptolemy III, who is the son of the original Ptolemy, who was Bernice's father as well. So it's Bernice's brother. Y'all follow me? Got this? This is real easy. It's real easy to keep up. Okay. Anyway, so now there's a historical writer named Jerome. He wrote a Latin translation of the Bible. He said that Ptolemy took back 2,500 idol statues and 40,000 talents of silver back to Egypt with him from the kingdom of the north. So something we can get from a history. Now, from the branch of Bernice's roots, basically, is when her brother rises up and invaded the territory of the north, and he killed Laodicea, or Laodice. Her name is pronounced Laodice, or something like that. I heard Laodicea from somebody, but it's read a different way. They seized the port of Antioch and carried a massive amount of booty back to Egypt. That's like, again, we find this from history. And he endured past the time of Seleucus. Now, in verse 9, later the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will soon return to his own land. However, the sons of the king of the north will assemble a mighty army that will advance like a flood and carry the battle as far as the enemy's fortress. So, back and forth. Okay, so the south goes up to avenge Bernice's death, and then they beat them, they take their stuff back, and then the north raises up an army, and they go down to the south to try to fight them. Seleucus of the north attempted an invasion of Egypt against Ptolemy of the south, was unsuccessful, and returned to Egypt. Again, what I am reading to you is from history books, okay? This is from history books, not from the Bible. So I'm reading you these examples of what's happened because the Bible gives us very detailed. I'm reading you what happened now. So how the predicted prophecy actually follows exactly what happened in history. And so he was unsuccessful, returned to Egypt, but his two sons arose in the place. We just read that. It says the sons of the king of the north assembled a great army, and they overwhelmed the south, returned to the north, and stirred up the conflict even more. The names of these two sons were Seleucus and Antiochus III the Great. Okay, it's another Antiochus. There's a lot of them. And his Antiochus, he is actually described kind of off and on throughout, all the way up to verse 19. Okay. In a rage, the king of the south will rally against the vast forces assembled to the king of the north. So, the new king of the south, Ptolemy, Philopator, if I was going to pronounce all the names here, you would really be lost. He was the son of Ptolemy III, was moved with rage, is what it told us here in the Bible, and we know this happened also from history. It was against him that the campaign of the two sons, Seleucus, had been waged. He was a man, okay, so this man that we're talking about here, Ptolemy, the new king of the south, Ptolemy IV, the historians tell us that he was a great lover of ease and luxury, and but accompanied by his wife/sister, okay, don't know about that, named Arsinoe, he went out to fight with the king of the north. Okay, so this is historical. Antiochus III the Great, according to the historian, there's a battle, and Antiochus met Ptolemy with, this is really interesting, just a little interesting side note, 62,000 infantrymen, 6,000 cavalrymen, and 102 elephants. But Ptolemy brought with him 70,000 infantrymen, 5,000 cavalrymen, and 73 elephants. And the multitudes of Antiochus were given into the hands of Ptolemy. Ptolemy killed 10,000 of Antiochus's infantrymen, 200 of his cavalrymen, and 5 of his elephants. I don't know why I can't say elephants today. And also taking 4,000 prisoners. After this victory, Ptolemy returned to a life of luxury and indulgence, losing the opportunity to solidify his gains against the north in the end, in spite of his victory. he did not prevail. So that's the story. What it just told us there, he would not prevail. So after the enemy army swept away, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived. That's what we just described. He returns to his life of luxury, his pride, and his vanity, and then his success is short-lived. A few years later, the king of the north will return, fully equipped army. Again, now the north is coming back to fight the south, and so now we have 14 years have gone by from the time of history, and during that time, Antiochus III raises up another multitude against him, and then in 203 BC is what we're talking about here. Ptolemy and his wife died, leaving the kingdom of the south to their 4-year-old son, Ptolemy V, Epiphanes. It was then that Antiochus came to the south with a multitude greater than the former, and with a great army and much equipment, rose against the king of the south, in addition to the northern kingdom. And the angel tells Daniel here, he says, violent men of your people, talking about some of the Jews, will exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision. So he has said that some of your people would rise up and join. So he says, violent men among your people will join them in fulfillment of this vision, but they will not succeed. So that does happen. Some Jewish people join and try to join in on this, but they do not succeed. And then according to the historian Polybius, Ptolemy's general Scopus went in haste in wintertime and overthrew the nation of the Jews. And then we get to verses 15, 16, and 17. The king of the north will come and lay siege to the fortified city and make plans to come. So Antiochus III the Great is what he's called. He set a siege against the city of Sidon and was there able to bring an end to Ptolemaic rule. So the Ptolemies come to an end, bottom line. Not even Scopus and his hand-picked leaders were able to withstand him. In the end, Antiochus was able to seize control of Palestine, which is Israel, whenever you use that term, the glorious land. But he didn't bring destruction upon himself. He did pave the way for the evils of eventually Antiochus Epiphanes. So he doesn't. This Antiochus the Great is not the same one as Antiochus Epiphanes, who will be later. Antiochus the Great would not make the mistake that Ptolemy did, and he determined to make the use of the opportunity to solidify his gains by bringing equitable terms. He arranged for his daughter, I think this is an interesting little side note, Cleopatra the first, basically she's referred to as the daughter of women in there, so it's a term that indicated her eminence as the first lady of the kingdom. Now, this is not the same Cleopatra, though. I hate to tell you that. Not the same Cleopatra that was the famous Cleopatra, the mistress of Julius Caesar. It's not the same one, but the name Cleopatra is interesting. So that is what happens. The actual marriage didn't occur until 193 BC, since Ptolemy was only 10 when the marriage was arranged. Okay. Sorry. But it would ensure the aid of Ptolemy later, and Antiochus would pursue warfare against Rome, leading to further solidification in his gains in the south, but the plan didn't work. Cleopatra ended up supporting Ptolemy's interests, and she sent congratulations to the Romans. Eventually, Egypt ended up aiding the Romans against Antiochus. So that's kind of verses 18 and 19. Okay, I'm going to stop because it's so much here. I'm going to give you bullet points next week so you can actually read all of this. All I want you to get, basically, I could just keep going on. There's so much you can read. This history is out there. It's something that you could actually go look up, read the details. I gave you a link. If you tried, some of you may have looked that up. Told you to go look at it on BlueLetterBible.com, where it gives you, BlueLetterBible.com is a great website with lots of great, what I would consider, for the most part, all very solid commentaries. So it's a good place to read some of this history. But what I think is really so important about it all, because we could just sit here and just keep reading, and it just goes on and on and on. Because as I read it to you from the Bible, you could see it was this back and forth, back and forth. I don't have to keep giving you these names to prove to you that there were real people that back up every one of those things that were described. This war back and forth between the north and the south happened. And eventually, Antiochus Epiphanes rises up, who we believe to be a precursor to the Antichrist. He was a horrible man to the Jews. He destroyed many of the Jews. He had this huge campaign against them, not just destroying them, but actually turning them away from God, and he did some horrible things. And he's actually, the second part of this chapter gets into his reign a little bit more and talks about what he does. And so we will get to that next week. We won't just go with the history though. We'll have some other fun things that we're going to talk about. But that will give you fun, that's relative, but you know what I'm saying. So anyway, but the deal is all these facts just prove to us that what was prophesied in all that specificity actually did happen. We don't even have to figure it out. The 4 kings, that is absolutely true. North, south, east, and west. The north and south fighting against each other is absolutely true. The coming and going, the whole connection, the giving in marriage of Berenice, and then later on Cleopatra, those are listed right here in the Bible, and they actually happened. None of that is made up. None of it is something that somebody just came back and said, oh, well, let's make this happen in history. This was prophesied 200 years before it ever occurred, 200 to 300 years. So none of this could have been known about. This is not something that was written about later. So there are some people out there that want to say that all of this, they want to say it was written down later, but there is no way that it could have been written down to this specific, it wouldn't have been written this way. It's clearly written as prophecy. So, I just realized I printed my notes twice. That's why I have so many. I thought, wow, gosh, 50 other pages. Okay, it's okay. I'm really at the end. So, I think that we can just sort of wrap it up with just a really, just a final thought here. So we're in the Holy Week. We are in this week that we consider to be one of the most, really probably the most special time for Christians in the world, all across the world. People are celebrating. Some churches do a service every single night. They do some kind of service every night, starting on Sunday night all the way through, celebrating the different Holy Week, the Passion Week, some people call it. It's the week where it was Jesus' last week before he goes to the cross. It was all of the things that he did. If you, I've written a blog, it's on my website, and I've actually been putting it on our Crossroads Facebook webpage as well. And it kind of chronicles everything that Jesus did every single day. So I encourage you to read it because it's very challenging. It's very powerful just to think about what Jesus did each day as he was headed to the cross. Because he knew, see, this is the thing, he was God. So let's go back to who is Jesus? He is God. He foreknew what was going to happen. From the moment he came in on that donkey, when they were singing it, saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, he knew that he was going to the cross 5 days later. He knew that. It wasn't something that he didn't know because he's God. So he knew that he was going to be turned over by Judas Iscariot. He was going to be betrayed. He was going to be denied. He knew that he would have a false trial that would be a farce, that it would be laughable at any type of justice system, even in that day. He knew all that was going to happen. He knew that his own people would reject him. He knew that he would be taking on all of the full wrath of God. He knew all of that because he was God. And yet he did it anyway. He did it. He laid his life down for us. It was not something that he came by surprise, that was a shock. It was predestined from the beginning of time. Once sin came into the world and God made the plan was going to be that one day he would take upon himself the sins of all of the people, and he would make a way back to himself, a way back to holiness, a way back to true righteousness. That was his plan. So it was predicted, starting in Genesis all the way, all of that prediction, all through the Old Testament, predicted the coming of Jesus. And then Jesus himself, as he started on this week and this journey to the cross, he knew what was going to happen. And so as you're kind of going through the rest of this week, I just encourage you just to remember what we are, who we are worshiping this week, who we are celebrating. We're celebrating the God who knows everything and knew everything. And I think when you think of it that way, when you realize that Jesus went to that cross knowingly, it takes on a whole different sort of feeling to you, because you recognize that this was a choice he made. This was not something that nobody took him to the cross, nobody put him on that cross, he allowed himself to be put on the cross. He tells them that when they bring him before the Sanhedrin, he says, or before Pilate, he says, you don't take my life, I lay my life down, or he doesn't say, I forgot the words exactly that he says there, it's in the blog, but he said, he went willingly to the cross, and so even knowing what the future was going to hold, and I think that is the God that we serve, one who is willing to do that for us. So I pray that as you are going through each day this week, that you'll take some time to reflect upon that every single day. What was Jesus doing? What was he thinking about? Knowing that 3 days from now he would be the Passover lamb. What was he thinking about along the way? We go all the way back to Exodus. We go back to Exodus when the children of Israel were in captivity, and the final plague was the plague of death, and they were to paint over their door frames take the blood of an unblemished lamb and paint it over their doorways, and then the death would pass over them. That's what the Passover stands for. Death would pass over them because of the blood of the lamb that they had put on there by faith. By faith, they did that. They didn't know what was going to happen. Remember, it was done by faith. They did this, but it wasn't the act that did it. It was the faith that they put into that did it. And that blood over there just represented their faith in the God who would pass over, and ultimately that is what Jesus became. He became the Passover lamb. He became the one who, by faith, we trust in. It's not something that we have to do. There's nothing we have to do in order to earn his salvation, in order to earn his love. We, by faith, put our faith in what he has done. And so just remember, as you're going to that, as going through this week, just what Jesus did, reflect on it, and really, really take some time to do that. And just be amazed and worship and reflect and just praise him for all of the things that happened along the way, but also, and some of his final, like as in this devotion that I've written, some of the final conversations he has with his disciples, they're just powerful, and we need to think about them because he knows he's going to the cross in a couple of days. He kept predicting his death too. Think about that. Jesus, along the way in the conversations he had with his disciples up until this week, way before, during those 3 years he was with them, he would tell them, one day he would tell them about his death. He prepared them over and over again. He predicted his own death because he's God. He predicted that it would happen, that he would be 3 days in the grave. He predicted all those things. So Jesus was the ultimate prophet, right? And there's many, many people, I'm gonna end here. There's many, many people out there in the world who will call Jesus a great prophet. They will say he was a great prophet, he was a great teacher. Many religions, the Muslim religion, even Hindu, Buddhist, and many others will claim that Jesus was a great prophet. But he wasn't just a prophet. He wasn't just a teacher. He was the Son of God. And only he can take away the sins of the world because he was the perfect Lamb. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for who you are and just for your word. And Lord, as crazy as some of it seems, Lord, at times as we read it and we just try to make sense of it, we recognize that it all has a purpose. It all just reminds us and shows us what an amazing God you are. And the prophecy that was made in Daniel about all the things that would happen later is nothing compared to the prophecy that was made about Jesus and about the coming of the Messiah. Lord, help us to just reflect on that and just really, really relish in just what this week represents. Lord, I pray for every person to just have a special encounter with you, have a very unique and special and personal encounter with you this week as we just celebrate what you've done, and we thank you for the amazing gift of salvation and eternal life. Lord, we love you, we praise you, we thank you for who you are, and we just commit the rest of this week to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.